Morning or good afternoon, and welcome to IAP2's monthly learning webinar, beginning with the brain in mind, one of our Denver Encores. On behalf of IAP2 Canada, IAP2 USA, and IAP2 Australasia, we'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. But perhaps the first thing that we should let you know is that Drew and I are without an internet connection today, so we're actually coming to you via our local coffee shop. So if all of a sudden you hear a little bit of Christmas music or a little bit of noise, our profuse apologies. We are doing our best to make sure that the show carries on. So with that, Drew, I'm just going to turn it over to you just to do a little bit of housekeeping.
And we have a few things just to mention here. This is, as always, a very interactive sessions. We encourage you all to take part in this. For example, just check and make sure that your microphones are unmuted. We'll take care of muting them here. If you have a question or anything like that, you want to make a comment, there's a couple of ways you can do that. One of them is, as you can see here on the screen, you've got that little yellow hand icon that you can click, and that will show up and tell Amelia that you want to ask a question, and we will come to you and open your microphone, and you can ask the question. Or if you're the shy, retiring type, you can type it into the question box, and Amelia will see that come up, and she'll break in at the appropriate time and ask the question for you. We also have the polls, too, so please take part in those surveys when they come up. It helps us get an idea, helps our presenter get an idea of who's on the line, what you think of what's going on. It gives you a chance to get interactive as well. We record these, and they're available for your professional development. We will send you the link to the recording generally in within about 24 hours, along with any other collateral material that Martine, our guest, might have for you. So watch for that. We also take a survey afterwards, kind of an exit survey. Gives you, in fact, it is an exit survey. It's not kind of. And it gives you a chance to give us some feedback on the general webinar experience. So if you can help us to keep these things going and keep these webinars getting better as they have over the years, please take part in that and send us your responses to that. And so that, I think, takes care of the housekeeping. So Amelia, I'm going to toss us back over to you, and you can get this show underway.
Excellent, Drew. Thank you so very much. And Drew, while I am introducing Martine, I'm wondering if you could please hand the screen over to Martine. So Martine Carcasson, PhD, is a professor in the Communications Studies Department of Colorado State University, the founder and director of the CSU Center for Public Deliberation, and the current chair of the Board of Directors of the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation. He considers himself a pracademic, both a practitioner and a scholar, constantly shifting from practice to theory and back again. His research is focused on helping communities address wicked problems more productively through improved public communication, community problem solving, and collaborative decision making. And with that, Martine, we are going to hand it over to you, and welcome. Thank you for your patience as we get going and get all of this sorted out.
All right, thank you so much, Amelia and Drew, for inviting me and giving me a chance to kind of talk about my work. To give you a little bit more background, just to kind of situate myself, my academic training back now 20 years ago was primarily in argumentation. I focused a lot on how people make arguments, particularly with difficult issues. What kind of sources do they cite? What kind of evidence are they using? What kind of logic or lack thereof do they make? My early work in grad school was focused much more on the presidential level. And when I made the transition to CSU about 14, 15 years ago now, I kind of switched from the national level to the local level, and also switched from primarily being a commentator to be more of a practitioner. So a lot of the work that I do is focused on how do we improve how we talk about tough issues as we go kind of in the community. This session was kind of tied to the presentation that I gave at the IAP2 conference in Denver earlier this year, and it's primarily kind of tied to a significant research project I did over the last 2 or 3 years, focusing on brain science and social psychology, and kind of what can we learn from those fields that will help us kind of improve our process design. So I'm going to try to talk here probably about 40 minutes or so to leave some time kind of at the end. Amelia might jump in if there's questions, clarification questions as we go. I'm going to be covering a lot of material. Some of these slides I'll go through pretty quickly, So I'm seeing this more as an overview, kind of a big picture, and then certainly, hopefully, there's opportunities to kind of dig in deeper, both in the Q&A and also kind of after that by email as we go. But I know we do have a set of kind of some initial polling questions. So if we want to go ahead and do those now, we can do those. Got some demographic questions, and then just a couple questions to get a sense of the biggest concerns you have with some of these issues that brought you to this webinar.
Excellent. Well, Martine, the questions are up. So where in the world are you? Are you in the USA, west of the Mississippi, east of the Mississippi, in Canada, Manitoba westward, or Canada, Ontario eastward, or Australasia? And if you're not in any of those locations, don't hesitate to send us something in the question box. So Drew, hopefully everyone's had an opportunity to respond. So let's see what we've got. All right. So west of the Mississippi, 51%. East of the Mississippi, 3%. In Canada, west of Manitoba, 32%. Eastward is 11%. And we have our 3% joining us from Australasia. So a big welcome to everybody. And Martine, back over to you.
Well, I think we're gonna work through all the demographic questions first, right? And then those first two that I sent you.
Excellent. Okay, well, we'll get the next question up, and it's up right now. In what sector do you work primarily? Government, private business, educational, nonprofit, or independent consultant? So just give everyone an opportunity to respond. All right, Drew, if you want to close that, let's see where people work. 56% from government, 7% private business, 5% educational, and 32% independent consultant, Martine. Back to you.
And let's continue with the questions.
You're being very patient with us. So if you work in government, what role do you have? So many questions this morning. All right, everybody, please answer this third question. All right, Drew, let's close it. So we have 2% elected officials, 5% city or county manager or assistant, 56% are with public engagement or communications, and 2% other, and 37% of our people on the call today are not in government. So I think, Martine, if I'm right, I think I'm back to you now, right?
Yeah, let me, we'll break up the questions a little bit, so I'll get into it, and then we'll ask those two questions about their view on the current quality of public discourse here kind of in a minute.
Excellent. Thanks, Martine.
Yeah, so I just want to pop this up. This is just a list of some of the topics. With my work, I started the CPD, the Center for Public Deliberation, about 11 years ago. It serves as an impartial resource for the Northern Colorado community. I actually trained undergraduate students through some coursework on to be facilitators and process people. And then we work with the city government, the county, and school districts and nonprofits here in Northern Colorado to kind of support the kind of processes I'll be talking about today. It's kind of based on the theory that democracy requires pretty high quality communication, but we unfortunately don't get that naturally. We actually get the opposite in a lot of ways. So how do we have people that have some resources and have some expertise that put all their energy into improving the quality of discourse? So that's the work that we do. And I also do this work nationally with the Kettering Foundation and their Centers of Public Life program to really kind of expand the role of these centers, but also to work with individual municipalities and organizations, community foundations, leadership programs to be this kind of sort of deliberative resource to their community. I should also say a lot of the research that I did here was supported by the Kettering Foundation, the project that I did. So the overview of this, I'm going to start with some bad news. So from this research from Brain Science, of what it kind of tells us and how it fuels kind of a lot of the partisanship and polarization that we're dealing with. Second, kind of expanding on that, how our interactions, our institutions, and our processes tend to kind of make these individual biases that we have in our brains and kind of expand them and make them worse. At that point, things will be pretty dark and depressing. But then I'll kind of turn and I'll talk about some of the good news. Part of what I learned from my research of the positive side of our brain that we can certainly kind of tap into. I will say that the bad parts of our brain are much easier and much more natural for us, but there are good parts in the brain with good process we'll tap into. And then I'll end talking a little bit about how, what kind of things can you do with process design, really with that idea of beginning with the brain in mind of how do you design a process, specifically trying to avoid triggering the worst parts of our brain and actually get to some of the good parts of our brain. So that will become the structure overall as I walk through the material today. So jumping on in, so what are we learning about social psychology and brain science? These are just some of the books that I read during my project. These are all pretty interesting. Hidden Forces that Shape Our Decision. This one won a Nobel Prize. It really argues that we like to think fast. We're cognitive misers. We want to use simple heuristics, but we do have the possibility of thinking slow, and again, based on a potential good process. You're not smart in 46 other ways you're deluding yourself, how your brain distorts and deceives. This one's one of my favorite, what makes your brain happy and why you should do the opposite. Jonathan Haidt's work is really getting a lot of play lately. He's got some great TED Talks if you like those type of things that really help us understand how we think differently. This is more of a classic, Thomas Gilvich's work, but really helps us understand why people hold on to bad information, even though it's been disproven in many ways. And this similar book, but much more recent, Tom Nichols' book on the death of expertise. I also looked at a couple hundred different journal articles and those type of things. If you want the full research, you can email me. I can email you the report that I did for Kettering. That's about 66-page report that really digs into the specific kind of research. But the overall kind of learnings that I pulled from that, I pulled some key themes. And first, the kind of bad news. Overall, we certainly crave certainty and consistency. Our brains are really wired that once we make a decision, particularly if that decision is kind of a controversial one or in a polarized environment, our brains work overtime to protect that decision and defend it from any sort of attack. Second, we're very much suckers for the good versus evil narrative. We are narrative creatures. We are not rational creatures. Through all cultures, through all times, we love the good versus evil narrative. We love the basic kind of hero and villain and quest. I pull up the Disney villains here because one of the reasons Disney is so popular is it gives our brains exactly what it wants, right? Unfortunately, I think we're teaching our children from the beginning that any difficult issue, the problem is some sort of hidden evil figure behind the scenes. And all we have to do to solve our problems is to find that villain and to vanquish them. And unfortunately, I think most problems are not that simple. And then third, and these three things really certainly combine, is we are groupish. We prefer to group to gather around the like-minded. People are using the word tribal here kind of as well. But we like to have our teams. We like to define our team as the good team and the other team as evil. And then our brains take over to really kind of feed that narrative and protect it in so many different ways. This groupish nature, there's two sides to it. So some of the worst things humans have ever done in history are because of this, but also some of the best things that humans have done in history are because of this. So it really kind of leads to the question of how are you tapping into this groupishness? And are you tapping it in to really polarize and create partisanship, or are you tapping into it to potentially bring people together? Certainly part of the transition of my work from a national stage to a local stage is particularly because of this. At the national stage, at least politically, there's two teams, kind of like the red and blue teams that you see here, and they feed directly into these negative narratives. Whereas at the local level, maybe your team is that local community, and some of those other differences get put to the background in some ways. And then fourth, which is particularly important to me and the academic background that I have, because of the first three, our brains are very powerful to filtering and cherry picking evidence to support those views and to support what we want out of those first three. So the research that I did really walks through these 5 stages of motivated reasoning. Motivated reasoning, kind of a term in the sense of we're often motivated to protect our team, motivated to defend our narratives, motivated to feel that we're consistent and we're certain. So instead of being motivated by, say, accuracy or motivated by solving problems, we're often our base model is to be motivated to protect the decisions that we've already made. And one quick note about that. I've seen a lot lately looking at partisanship and polarization and kind of blaming that we're overly emotional versus rational. And I'll push back on that a little bit because it's not as simple as being emotional versus rational. these motivated reasonings are rational motivated reasonings, rational to those people, right? So they're framing things in a way that it seems, I mean, it's essentially deductive logic. So it's not that they're being emotional and not logical, it's they're being logical in a particular way that we need to engage differently. The other thing I'll say about that too is there's a danger to assuming kind of rational is good and emotional is bad. So part of the argument, and I think Aristotle made this very well 2,000 years ago, that you know those are much more kind of a yin and a yang versus an either or, and it certainly is reasonable to be angry sometimes, and reasonable to be sad or to be fearful. So I think people need to be careful of assuming kind of emotions are always bad, and we want rationality. But with that, these 5 stages, and these are chronological stages. So the first stage is, you know, what information even gets to us in some ways. And these terms, selective exposure and echo chambers and media bubbles, I don't think most people knew those terms 3 years ago, but after the 2016 campaign, I think they're certainly out there. Conservatives tend to get their news from Fox News, and progressive get it from NPR, or at least here in the United States, NPR or MSNBC. The dangerous thing here is Facebook and Google, and does this work for you? So if you tend to click the conservative links, or you tend to engage your progressive friends more on Facebook, then you're inherently going to get more and more of just that side, and you're getting a filter without you even realizing it in some cases. The second step is, once we actually get the information in our brain, how we interpret that. And the research here is getting scarier and scarier. I think confirmation bias is probably one of the most important terms that we need to know of why people aren't changing their minds. One of the quotes that I pulled, this is Jonathan Haidt, essentially paraphrasing Tom Gilovich's work, so I'll give them both credit. But this quote, I think, has become more and more kind of important and kind of powerful in my work. That when we want to believe something, we ask, can I believe it? And if we find just kind of one piece of even pseudo evidence to support it, we can be done. We can stop thinking. But if we don't want to believe something, we ask, must I believe it? And once again, if we find one kind of shred of evidence that seems to fit that, we can stop thinking. And certainly when people from 2 different sides of an issue are asking those different questions, you can see how we can polarize so quickly. You can also see, you know, for example, the last couple of weeks, some of the mistakes that were made by the media here in the United States can feed those narratives, can feed those conspiracies. Just one mistake can easily kind of, you know, prove a broader kind of argument about the role of the media and fake news and those type of things. The backfire effect in particular is an interesting one. Research here is pretty new, and there's a little bit of back and forth, but there is some clear evidence here coming in that knowledge and evidence and facts aren't going to save us. We keep on thinking that we can always go back, and if the facts are all on my side, I'll eventually win the argument. But there's research now that shows that actually as the quality of your evidence increases, the backfire might even increase even more. And the reason for this is often you'll avoid counter evidence, but if you don't avoid it, you're engaging it directly, and your brain is really good at overcoming it. So as the quality of evidence goes up, your brain's working even harder to overcome it, and then you essentially feel, or you know, people getting attacked essentially feel that, hey, they brought their best evidence and I knocked it out of the park. So the implications of this is quality evidence ejected into a polarized debate will actually polarize things even more, because each side, you know, eats up the evidence on their side and then feel they either ignore or overcome the evidence on the other. And obviously the other side is doing the exact opposite. So it's scary things that we can't assume facts are going to save us. Obviously, I'm not saying facts don't matter. I'm saying in a polarized, hyperpartisan environment, facts are often going to not work or even backfire. So we had to change the kind of culture. In a lot of ways, we have to change the processes so facts matter again. And that's part of the work that we'll be talking about. Next, how we make attributions. Again, we're narrative beings. And a lot of our reasoning is, as new facts come in, our brain is very good at fitting the new facts within our narrative rather than, you know, challenging that narrative or getting us to change those narrative. I think George Bush actually captured it pretty well. This is at the event honoring the Denver police officers that were ambushed summer before last. Too often we judge other groups by their worst examples while judging ourselves by our best intentions. Those are the narratives that we have in our head about our team and their team. And any new evidence can come and fit in that perspective and just reinforce those narratives. Then how we make decisions, we want simple rules again, but we're picking rules. We are in our brain being very logical. We're just very narrow in terms of which rules we think apply to any specific situation. And then lastly, even what we remember is biased. What stories stick in our head that we share, the anecdotes we share over and over again are the ones that fit our narratives. The ones that challenge them, we tend to not even notice, or we quickly forget. So all that leads together to individuals, particularly in again, a polarized environment, can have a pretty strong blinders on with their perspective. So that leads us to our second kind of point. So we start with a bad news individual, and then how those individuals interact with their environment gets worse with the interactions, the institutions, and different processes. So I'm building this model of a vicious cycle of exaggerated polarization or partisanship. The good news is it is exaggerated. I don't think things are nearly as bad as we think. We're not nearly as divided. I think some significant differences exist, and those, because of this vicious cycle, get blown up. And maybe this is a good place to stop for a second instead of jumping into this and ask those next two questions. So just to see from your perspective where you see where we are with public discourse right now.
Thanks, Martine. So the questions are now up on the screen. Which best represents your perspective on the quality of public discourse? Scary bad, problematic, neutral, generally good, or excellent? So we'll just give everyone just a couple of seconds to respond to that. All right, Drew, let's shut this down and let's see what we've got. All right, scary bad is at 27%. Problematic is at 56%, neutral 5%, generally good 10%, and excellent at 2%. So Martine, do you want the next question?
Yeah, let's go ahead and do the next question.
All right, Drew? So the next question is up. Which of the following is a high area of concern for you? And this one you can have multiple answers, so please check all that apply. Growing polarization or partnership, lack of respect for experts and facts, apathy, usual suspects dominating discussion, or anti-government attitudes. So just maybe a couple more seconds to respond to that. All right, Drew, let's close that down for a second. Growing polarization or partnership is at 74%. Lack of respect is at 68%. Apathy at 50%. Usual suspects at 63%. And anti-government attitudes at 58%. So Martine, back to you now.
Thank you. Yeah, so pretty high numbers kind of on all five of those as we kind of go through, and looks like about 83% of them of y'all picked one of the two negative terms for quality. I have a slide I do a lot with my presentations using the clickers that have a list of kind of positive adjectives and negative attitudes to public engagement, in almost probably about a 90% clip. When I allow people to pick the top three, they pick just the negative one. So a lot of the work that we're doing is how do we change that, right? How do we get people to kind of pick some more of the positive adjectives like robust or broad range of voices and those type of things. So yeah, let me dive into my explanation of for this growing polarization and partisanship that was the highest concern for those y'all on the line. So we start with what I just talked about. The individual develops subconscious biases that through the brain science and social psychology, and then we can look at those people with the blinders on. Go out in the world and try to interact with others, and it tends to not go very well. Catherine Schultz actually has a book that really kind of dug into how do we react when people tell us that we're wrong. She's got a nice little TED Talk out there if you want to kind of track it down. But she argues that when people tell us we're wrong, we kind of go through three stages or steps. The first step is the ignorance assumption. We assume they think we're wrong because they don't have the information that we have. So we enlighten them, right? We share our information with them because surely that will fix the problem. But it typically does not. They still disagree with us. So then we have to upgrade to the idiot assumption. Right? So the idiot assumption is, okay, they have the same information that I have, but they're just not as smart as me. They're not as bright. They don't understand the implications of that information. So that typically works for a while. But, probably we interact with them in lots of different ways, and they seem so sharp in so many other ways. It's just this political thing that they get so wrong. So eventually, Catherine argues that we upgrade to the evil assumption. Now, evil might be a little too strong a word here, But I think the shift from the second to the third step that's important here is there are assumptions about motives. At the third step, you're basically assuming they know that I'm right and they're wrong, but they refuse to admit it because of some other kind of hidden kind of motive. And that's a huge problem for democracy, because once we shift to the point that we assume that the people that we're arguing with or engaging with are not being truthful or not kind of revealing their motives, that's when communication breaks down. That's when conspiracy theories kind of take over, and we'll see a little bit more of that later. So that's the interaction effects because of the blinders on. Trying to have conversations, whether that's online or face-to-face with people with kind of opposing blinders, it kind of blows up, and it increases the perceived level of polarization. Then it's something what I call the Russell effect. And I built this Russell effect, kind of a term I'm trying to catch on here, from this meme from philosopher Bertrand Russell, that the whole problem in the world is that fools and fanatics are always so certain of themselves, and the wiser people so full of doubts. So this contributes to kind of the exaggerated polarization, because the loudest voices is kind of how I define it, that the loudest, the most confident, the most active voices are often the ones with the kind of strongest blinders on. Right? And people that see different sides of the issue, the people that are kind of struggling with perspective, tend not to even show up to public meetings, much less walk up to that microphone or send the email or letters to the editor and those type of things. Right? So part of the problem is we seem so polarized because the loudest voices are the most polarized voices. So here, this is our last question of the day. I'm just kind of curious, as I've been playing with this Russell effect for a while. Your response to that is that you have experiences that kind of bear this out, or not with your own personal work.
So thanks, Martine. Your question is up. What is your opinion of the Russell effect? A huge issue, moderately important issue. I've seen it happen here and there. Haven't seen it at my work. Not sure what you mean by it. So hopefully people can just think quickly and provide us with a response. So Drew, hopefully people have had an opportunity to think a little bit about this, and so we're going to close it up and see the response. So Martine, 58% think that this is a huge issue, 20% moderately important, 11% here and there, 2% haven't seen it in my work, and 9% not quite sure what you mean by that. So so back over to you with those responses.
Yeah. So to talk a little bit more about it, particularly for those 9%, part of the idea here, a lot of the work that I do when we call a meeting about an issue, typically the people most motivated to show up are the ones that are for sure for it or against it or have a strong kind of opinion already. Those that kind of don't quite understand the issue or kind of more in the middle ground are likely less motivated to show up, and certainly less motivated to stand up and walk up to that microphone and express an opinion. Our political system right now really rewards confidence, rewards kind of strong voices. So walking out to that microphone and saying, I'm not too sure about this. I see the benefits, but is it worth the cost? That seems very odd, right? So that's going to be a process design point that I make, is how do we design processes that, instead of feeding kind of the quest for certainty, and feeding kind of the loudest, most biased voices, really help us make a space for these middle ground people. And some other work, I'm really talking about how we need to really cultivate the collaborative problem solvers in our community. And we need them showing up to the meeting. We need people that don't have their minds made up yet showing up to the meeting. And that all kind of ties to kind of trying to undo the impact of this Russell effect. So that's the interactions. And then talking about institutions and processes. So to kind of continue the vicious cycle, the internet is really a net negative here. Obviously wonderful in so many ways. For example, being able to have people on a webinar from all over the world. But in terms of taking some of those negative aspects of human nature and making them worse, the internet really kind of hits all the bad points in there. Makes it so easy to gather around the like-minded, makes it so easy to kind of feed selective exposure and confirmation bias, of finding the worst possible examples of the other side and spreading those as representative examples, and going through back and forth, right? Yes, there's some really nice tools on the internet that can help bring people together across perspectives. They don't tend to be very popular. What's much more popular is those internet tools that really polarize us even more and help us kind of get into our teams. Next, our overly adversarial political system. This is a lot of the work that I did early part of my career. I won't walk through all the different points on this slide, so I'll let you kind of look over that here in a second. But really, particularly if you're looking at the national level, I mean, literally, if I was to try to design a communication system, a political communication system that was purposely really kind of led to the worst possible discussion about tough issues, in many ways, I would design our system. By having a two-party system in the United States that fits perfectly with the good versus evil kind of narrative, having winner-take-all elections really kind of incentivizes, that justifies any means to those ends. Having it so expensive and so cutthroat really kind of drives away lots of people that we probably want to run for office. And it all kind of comes together. One way to summarize this whole slide is we really have a political system. Again, my experience is much more in the United States, but I don't think it's all necessarily that different in other places, that rewards bad arguments and punishes good arguments. And I think the issues that we're dealing with are difficult enough already with that additional kind of layer on top of it. And then going away from just elections and national politics, but just most of the basic ways we've engaged people, most of the public process. Now, if you're on an IAP2 webinar, you already think differently than this, right? But in my research, I kind of walk through all these kind of dominant ways we engage people. Have a few paragraphs on each of these kind of bullet points. But the argument that I make at the end of it is that the problem with most of our typical public processes is we engage people too late. So they've already made their decision. So they're showing up to defend their decision rather than showing up to kind of, to think or to learn or to engage or interact people. We often engage people when it's a yes/no issue, when it's for or against a specific point of legislation. First, so it doesn't really allow them to problem solve. It really kind of only allows them to be an advocate for it, or primarily a critic against them. The advocates for tend to stay home. The critics against tend to show up. So that's where people think most public process is just people complaining, because most public process is almost designed for people to only be able to complain. Primarily provides opportunities for individual expression. That's the one at a time in the microphone. We tend to have much interaction and engagement, and that's really what caters to the entrenched voices, the people that can organize and get people to show up, to walk up to that microphone, or to send emails to decision makers, or flood the media. Or social media are the ones that the loudest voices that get heard. And the last one that you'll see is particularly important to me as we think about changing things. We have public process that does not have the interaction and the learning that we really need to take on these issues in a much better way. And then lastly, the media as an institution also contributes to the cycle. The media loves the conflict. They know that that's going to bring eyeballs and drive clicks and those type of things. That's why we have such kind of a horse race analysis of elections and those type of things. And now that our media has kind of polarized in itself, it drives that even more in some sense. And that's what they're giving people what they want. But the result of this is kind of an ongoing cycle that kind of gets worse and worse, and the implications are significant. So much of our politics now is anecdote wars, particularly online, of, again, finding the worst example of the other side and kind of throwing it at and sending it to people, to like-minded people. The mean-spiritedness and the contempt is at historic levels in a lot of ways, right? I mean, not that campaigns in the 17th and 18th century weren't mean-spirited, but the actual contempt for each other is higher. People just loving the fact that supporting policies just because it makes the other side bad is something that seems a little bit different. And that really leads to the assumption of negative motives, which fuels conspiracy theories. And I think we all know that the conspiracy theories are particularly difficult because anything said to try to undo a conspiracy inherently fits within that conspiracy, and then it kind of takes over. And we've seen that certainly in lots of different ways. And probably the most important of all of this is we have real issues we need to be talking about. But this kind of hyperpolarization, exaggerated hyperpolarization, kind of takes everything over. It makes this game that we never actually have a chance to have the real conversations. So that's the end of the depressing stuff. Hopefully here about the next 10 minutes or so, I'll kind of, okay, what do we do about this? And talk a lot more about the good news. So the good news, and this is from my research of really digging in for a couple of years, that we inherently are social. We want purpose. We're not individualistic, right? We're not so kind of self-protective in a way. So this is the flip side of this being a social being. That can be a good thing, right? And we see after disasters, people flocking to help people regardless of what they want. Daniel Pink's work really kind of explains what we're motivated, that people want autonomy and they want purpose and they want mastery. And those are good things that you can tap into in your local community and really kind of, drive and build these co-creators and these collaborative problem solvers, which can be these essentially super citizens for you if you figure out a way of doing that. Even Maslow's hierarchy of needs that I think most people probably are familiar with, going all the way back to grade school. Bad process tends to tap into the bottom two or the bad side of the third of belonging, of the hooligan kind of side of belonging. Good process, though, can tap into the positive side of belonging, and also then bleed up to the esteem needs and self-actualization. So how do we design process to get to that part of it? We're inherently empathetic. All the research shows that we care about other people. There's a really interesting debate now in the field about can there be a sense of global empathy? What are the limits of empathy? And actually have one of my graduate students, their project this spring semester is going to be really kind of digging into that a little bit more. But there's a lot of possibility there of how do we kind of tap into that in different ways. Most importantly, we are inherently pragmatic and creative. This is the defining feature of our species. Unfortunately, so much public process never taps into that. It's so focused on, so good at tapping into the good versus evil and simplistic thing that we don't have to be creative. All we have to do is vanquish evil. But when we shift the problem, when we get away from the simple good versus evil narrative and actually put, as I'll say later, the wickedness into the problem, all of a sudden you're tapping into a different part of the brain, and it's exciting kind of what you can see can come out of it. And then lastly, we can overcome our bad tendencies and build better habits. Yes, our brain is geared towards the negative ones. It's much more basic for us to kind of fall into those first characteristics, but the brain can be retrained. And we can develop a culture, particularly in our local communities, for thinking differently. So how do we kind of create the kind of institutions, the kind of processes, and the kind of civic engagement programs that really help kind of highlight these characteristics and build them up rather than the others? To go back to the concern about the backfire effect and the fact that facts don't change minds, the good news is what does change people's minds is a genuine conversation with people they respect. That's when they're all of a sudden going to have those aha moments. That's where it finally overcomes some of these kind of basic features of our bad brains. So a lot of my work, a lot of all of our work is how do we create more opportunities for people to have genuine conversations with people that think differently than them, but that they can build and kind of learn to kind of respect. And those kind of relationships, that kind of bridging social capital, as Robert Putnam would work, is critical for us to explicitly design processes to build both short term to make better decisions, but also long term to build that culture in our communities for a different way of talking. The bad news, as you can guess, if you look at most of our processes, they don't do that. Right? Most of our processes clearly tap into the worst part of our brains and rarely tap into those four that I talked about. So to finish, okay, how do we tap into the good part? And I'm assuming a lot of y'all already know a lot of this stuff. Again, if you're on a webinar for IEP2, as mentioned in my bio, I'm currently the board chair of the National Coalition of Dialogue and Deliberation here in the United States. So I wanted to pop this up. If you're not familiar with deliberative process and deliberative process design, this is a great resource guide. If you Google it, it's available online. It has tons of great links to different kind of organizations. But deliberation generally is process design, really, explicitly designed for people to interact and for people to have conversations with each other and to get beyond the one time of the microphone and the individual collection of opinions that we get so often. So I'm going to highlight like 5 key components of deliberative engagement. In the research project, I really show how these specifically are designed to tap in to avoid triggering the negative parts of the brain and tap into the positive parts of the brain. In particular, kind of an overall deliberative framing on how we talk about issues. I don't really have time to walk through the notion of wicked problems. If you're not familiar with that, I'll in the follow-up email, I'll have some kind of links to that. I also have a wicked problems mindset page on Facebook that I use kind of as a blog to talk through. But a lot of our work is we frame things as wicked problems, and by that, this is the simple definition of wicked problems is inherently involves competing learning values that can't be resolved. And that really go against the simplistic good versus evil narrative. Our brains want it to be, I have good values, and they reject those good values. But in reality, most of the tough issues, there's multiple values that are all relevant, that are all positive, that just don't fit together very well. So when you frame things as wicked problems, the magic is you're you switch from focusing on wicked people and you put the wickedness in the problem. And if you do that successfully, you're also switching from the simple good versus evil narrative. You're turning that part of the brain off, and you're turning on the collaborative problem solver part of the brain, and people work together on that problem. So these are just some of the characteristics of the wicked problems mindset that I'm working on, the book project I'm finishing. But like I just said, you presume wicked problems, not people. You design processes that help people be more comfortable with uncertainty. So we don't turn on that part of the brain. We make it okay to think out loud. We make it okay not to be confident in your opinion. You get people that are focused much more on just improving the conversation versus winning the argument, and you make them a kind of key part of the process. You find those underlying tensions that are part of all wicked problems, and you really long-term build a culture in your community for this ongoing conversation. Right? And a lot of that, as you see up there too, you want a broad range of actors. And this is often the hardest part, you want to start the discussion upstream before people have picked sides, before the teams have formed, even before specific legislation has been proposed. How do you create conversations in your community that are about how do we define the problems together versus just looking at specific solutions? Another key component of deliberative engagement is for almost all our processes, we have some sort of discussion guide or backgrounder. A lot of my work is making sense of the broader noise out there online or face-to-face, or everyone that speaks at city council at one time on the microphone, and then I turn that into a document that helps us understand the different issues. And the power of a document being created, the purpose of the document is to spark deliberation versus the purpose to spark persuasion, can really kind of reframe the issue. So I'll pop just a few sources that have lots of examples of these sort of discussion guides. National Issues Forum, Public Agenda, and Everyday Democracy, have online PDFs that really lots of different issues. Local communities often have to kind of develop the expertise and the skill set to kind of create their own. But these are kind of critical to changing the conversation and helping people have the kind of conversations that we need them to have. People often don't have the skill set to disagree with other people face to face. Or they either avoid conflict or they love the conflict, which is a problem as well. But these discussion guides become something else that they focus on, and once again helps us switch from being opponents to being collaborators, because all of a sudden the table now is working together to improve that document and react to that document versus having to react to each other. Right? Small groups, I think, are a key aspect of deliberative engagement. You see the picture on the bottom. Of having people in a circle actually talking to each other versus at one time on a microphone. That's critical for overcoming kind of the Russell effect, like I said. Deliberative facilitators are key. This is, I think, why my program works so well. I've got a small army of students that are really sharp, and I have them for at least an entire year to train them to be at these events. So someone's at the table that's using all their time, all their energy to improve the discussion versus to win an argument. I'm working more and more for universities to do this for their communities, but also cities and counties and nonprofits can develop their own kind of cadre of facilitators. But I often have two people at every table, a facilitator and a note taker, but to have people at the table that are process oriented and focused on that can really change the dynamic. And then lastly, for deliberation, you need time. You need, again, to be upstream, but you also, you can't do this quickly. And it also takes so much time. We can't do this for every issue. But how in our communities do we pick kind of the key issues that are ripe for deliberation and use those not only to move the needle of that issue, but also to build that long-term culture in our community. Right? Only a couple of minutes here left, and then we'll still have some time for questions. So if you think overall, what do we need public process to do? The bottom line is we need opportunities for people to have a voice and free speech. And I think we do that, right? We have one time on the microphone or all the different ways. We have so many mechanisms for people to express their individual opinion. But too often we stop there. As we really kind of improve public process, we actually need process that help people listen to each other and interact with each other and engage. And that's where those blinders are going to fall off, when they actually have real conversations, with all the components, with the discussion guide, with the ground rules, with the framing of wicked problems, with the facilitators. That helps us not have those negative interactions that Catherine Schultz kind of talked about. How do we create process that build mutual understanding and respect? And that's where minds start really being changed, and that's where we start tapping in again to the collaborative problem solver that's in people. We need processes that help us differentiate strong and weak arguments, right? So facts matter again, and quality of the argument matter again. And once we get away from the hyperpartisanship and we're together as problem solvers, then we want good information instead of pushing back respond in important ways. And then long term, what we need is, instead of public input processes, we need public learning processes. How do we create these opportunities for people to come together and your public to be an incredible resource? The public's not just a voter or a complainer or a taxpayer or a customer, which are horrible metaphors, but your citizens. The best use of your citizens is engaging them in creating them and supporting them and sustaining them as collaborative problem solvers. And that, in the long term, is the kind of communities that we need, that tap into the best part of our brains, the purpose of us having the kind of communities we really want to have, right? So earlier, the bad news was this vicious cycle of exaggerated polarization that all feeds on itself and is this vicious cycle. But what I just walked through, there's research that shows that there's a virtuous cycle of this authentic engagement or deliberative engagement, that when you give people a chance to have these real conversations, which I do think, from my experience, they're starving for, they start developing mutual understanding, that the caricatures, the blinders kind of start falling down. They start building trust and respect across perspective, that the critical social capital we need. Then they actually start learning, they start working together, and they refine their opinions. And then that's what really creates this potential for collaboration and co-creation that needs to be happening, particularly at our local level. And the good news is that's a virtuous cycle that feeds on itself. Each time we do this, it's easier to do the next time, and individual communities can certainly kind of build up the culture for this. So with that, I am done. We still got about 14 minutes for me to kind of jump back and deal with kind of any questions that comes up. So Amelia, I don't know if you grabbed some questions along the way, or if we've got people raising their hands.
I did. I do have a couple of questions for you, Martine, and thank you so very much for the presentation. And again, just a quick apologies for anyone that's hearing background noise. So the first question that I have is, one of the things that a lot of our members and friends talk about is the importance of building relationships in advance of a project. Quite often, as P2 practitioners, we're brought into the process when there's a project to manage and support and deliver. But as we're listening to you today, we're hearing about relationships, and not just picking people up and dropping people off, but the continuity of those relationships. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about where you see the importance of relationships are in building those relationships as we go into our P2 processes.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue, and I've written some on this, and so afterwards or you can go to my website, the CPD website, to have some of these. But I argue particularly for the importance of these local centers that are going to be these hubs of democracy. I think universities are a great fit for them, but I think also, United Way is becoming more of a convener, community foundations, leadership programs, but for them to be locally situated, because I think it's going to be hard to just kind of bring an outside firm to kind of, they can run an individual meeting, an individual process, but for the long-term kind of culture, to have local institutions that can build those long-term relationships, right? That can build a reputation for trust, that can build a reputation for being an honest broker of information, to try to take on some of the fake news and kind of the dismissal of data and those type of things. So I think we have to think about, how do we recreate some of these mediating institutions or bridging institutions in our communities? So many of our institutions now just kind of feed the polarization. And we need to rebuild the ones we used to have, or create new ones to help that. And I think having the Centers for Public Life, as Kettering kind of frames them, or Center of Public Relation like mine at universities, for me, it's such a great fit, because it fits the mission and purpose of the university in so many different ways. We're giving students great experience on collaborative problem solving, and at the same time providing capacity for our communities to kind of have these kind of conversations as we go. So that win-win-win, I think, is so critical as we think about, and a lot of that goes back to your question of, we're there long term to not only build relationships individually with these different groups, but also to be a catalyst for them to build relationships amongst themselves.
I love that, because I must admit, in many of the small groups that I help facilitate, I might leave a process, but they've now created relationships around the table that will last. So I love that statement. Thank you so much. So another quick question from Francis. Just wondering, are your table facilitators paid, or are they volunteers? And how do you manage the costs of this approach?
Yeah. Well, my table volunteers are students that are getting class credit, right? So that's part of the win-win-win. So the students are joining a program. It's a 3-hour class their first semester, or 3-credit-hour class. They all come back for at least a second semester. So every semester I have some new students and some experienced students. Some of them stay 3 or 4 semesters. They can continue to get credit for the class if they like. I also have a group of community facilitators that have come to my training, and they're volunteers. But the students are essentially getting compensated by getting class credit to kind of be this resource. If you don't have a university, I work with cities. I know the city of Longmont does this really well. That Larimer County does as well. Is they've created facilitation teams within their government. So they have employees from across the city or the county government, whether it's utilities or police or whatever it may be, that spend some time really getting trained as facilitators. So then they can be calling on that facilitation team to kind of come as part of their job to help. So if the police department wants to do an engagement, instead of having police officers facilitate, they can pull people from other departments of the city. So, but thinking long term, how do you build the capacity for that deliberate engagement? Because yes, it is very expensive. And I think once people see the value of it, it's expensive short term, but I think long term it certainly pays dividends. So I think you'll start seeing cities and counties in states investing more in deliberative capacity, whether that's their own or having the funds to pay private firms. But I think in the meantime, I think if every college and university in the country, or I guess in the world, has a program like what we're doing here and what we're building through the Kettering kind of Foundation Centers for Public Life program, I think you'd see a significant impact in institutions.
So thanks for that, Martin. Sort of a follow-up question, and I'm sure this is true, but do you provide some basic training? I know that at the City of Longmont, they certainly do provide the training for all of their facilitators, but for yourself with your students, any tips that you could provide our participants?
No. Yeah, I mean, again, it's a 3-hour course. Their first semester is all training, and bouncing back and forth and getting events and those type of things. So, I mean, I certainly have a lot of material out there. I'm happy to share kind of how we train facilitators as we kind of go through. I mean, I think there is a lot of my work, I barely touched on it today, does come from the framework of wicked problems. So a lot of our training for the facilitators is, get them to think about wicked problems, to help, before the meetings, we're really helping them understand what are all the underlying values tied to that issue, and what are the inherent tensions between those. So then when people are coming and they're really, picking one value and framing it simply just by that value and assuming I've got a good value, anyone who disagrees with me is against that value, it helps them kind of change that conversation. But for every event, we can design the facilitation guide. We have a time in class to walk through it and prepare, and then actually run the event. And then, importantly, critical, I think, for facilitation, it's such a self-reflective practice. So being able to reflect on it and talk about situations, and there's not really right answers on facilitation. There's always so many different responsibilities the facilitator's balancing. But if people are really interested in kind of training stuff, I'm happy to kind of share some of the material that we do for our training. And we are also the Center of Public Deliberation. We hired the first full-time staff person this summer. I was on sabbatical this fall, so I'm just about to get back here locally, but we're wanting to become more and more of a national resource. We've got graduate students that are doing research projects on public engagement that will be we already have some of those things up on our website, and certainly kind of how to train facilitators from this particular kind of wicked problems perspective is one of the things that we really want to kind of develop and share our expertise.
That's sorry, Martin, that's excellent. And certainly we'd love to share with all of our membership as well, the great work that you're doing. So a couple of other quick questions. One of the things that a lot of P2 practitioners try and do with the process now is to create ownership, creating ownership both of potentially the problem or opportunity that's out there, but also very much creating ownership of the solution. And it speaks a little bit to the creativity and innovation that you mentioned throughout the process. So just sort of thinking through, from the sounds of things, we need to continue to do this. It shouldn't just be the individual or the client's or the sponsor's problem, but our problem, so that we can move forward together. Just any thoughts on that statement?
Yeah, I mean, I'll go back. The slide that I had about the drawbacks of overly political or overly partisan processes. Part of that is it doesn't fuel ownership, right? It really fuels blame, right? You just have to blame the other side. When you have a deliberative process, I think you inherently create a lot more ownership and a lot more connection, and that's what's tapping into that sense of purpose, right? People want to matter to their community, right? People want to make an impact. So I think the deliberative processes really kind of get into that in different. Well, another kind of, I didn't have time to talk about that today, but another kind of basic tool that I use a lot is Sam Kainer's model of participatory decision making, and the kind of the diamond of decision making with the groan zone that many of y'all might be familiar with. But I think that also really develops a lot of ownership, both on the front end, because you're asking people's opinion, you're wanting divergent thinking. So ideas you might not have thought of might come out, and if you're kind of using their idea, obviously they're going to be excited about that and stick with it. But also on the back end, when decisions are made, if the process is seen as legitimate, people are much more likely to support it, even if they're against it, right? A huge problem with elections is if all you need is 51% of the vote, or even not that, just a plurality, there's no reason for you to engage the other side, and you clearly make winners and losers. And what happens is, the losers, instead of saying, "Ooh, I think that's a bad idea," but well, they're saying, "No, I'm gonna dedicate my life to making sure it doesn't work," right? But when you have a deliberative process, it takes longer, it might be more expensive, but even the quote losers tend to support it, right? They're saying, "Okay, I think this is the wrong way to go, but let's make sure it works," and that's an inherent part of the legitimacy, I think, of a good deliberative process, which is critical to that long-term success.
Agreed. And you must have you must have been reading Eric's mind, because Eric was his question was, the cost and time involved with collaborative decision making is often seen as a significant disincentive to implementation. So again, how do we combat this mindset based on what we've just been learning?
Yeah, I keep on, the things that pop in my head is stuff I didn't get a chance to cover today, but one of the basic theories that I've used is called the cycle of deliberative inquiry, and it fits with that, one of those things I mentioned about the wicked problems mindset, that we have to think about this as an ongoing conversation, right? So I have a model where the ongoing conversation is kind of on the outside, actions in the middle, but one of the features of wicked problems is you don't solve wicked problems. We're never going to find the perfect kind of mix of values. Identify that and then just apply that, and then poverty is gone, or those type of things. So part of the wicked problems mindset is recognizing that it has to be an ongoing conversation. I mean, democracy in so many ways has to be an ongoing conversation. The tensions between equality and freedom and security and our liberty and liberties of future generations and all those things, we're never going to resolve which of those is most important. They have to be an ongoing kind of discussion and tweaking, kind of moving back and forth. So I think once you have that mind frame, that mindset, I think that changes the conversation, because you're not looking for those magic bullets that our brains love. You're not looking for the devil figures our brains love, but you're much more comfortable with the uncertainty and working together to try to improve things as much as possible, while recognizing, we're not just going to have a technical solution to these tough, wicked problems.
Thanks for that. Just a very specific question from Brad right now. He's just wondering about deliberation for early childhood education, and knowing your background, whether or not you have that, or you could share it with us, or whether Brad should contact you directly.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't done as much specifically with early childhood. We certainly, we have a group here, the Poudre School District, the think tank. So we work a lot with high schoolers across. And then we often take the high schoolers into middle schools. We've done a few things with elementary schools. But I will argue this is a paper that I'm working on right now that I hope to have done pretty well soon. But thinking about the implications of everything I covered today to civic education, right? For example, I think the brain science and social psychology has to be basic knowledge that everyone has. Like, this is why your brain wants things so simple, and how do we kind of get away from that? So one of the arguments I'm making, did a review of a lot of civic education kind of reports and manifestos, and it seems like the dominant kind of metaphor or adjectives people use is we want our citizens to be informed and engaged, and recognizing now, because of wicked problems and because of how our brains work, informed doesn't work anymore, because the more informed you are, likely the more misinformed you are, because you're informing yourself through those lenses. So then when you're engaged, you're probably engaged badly, right? So part of what I'm trying to do with the civic education, and I think this could start as early as early childhood, is the ideal citizen isn't just an informed and engaged citizen. The ideal citizen is the wise collaborator. That's the goal that we have to have. that understands the types of problems we're dealing with, that understands kind of how brains work, and that's the mindset, and then the skill set is, okay, how do I work across these type of things? So that's the next work that I'm doing is really to kind of tease that out, and really have us think a little bit differently long term on what is the ideal citizen and the kind of problems that we're dealing with and the kind of partisanship that we're faced with.
Well, thank you so much, Martine. Someone sent in a statement, and some of our biggest critics can become the best champions. So I think it speaks to the importance of taking the time and bringing people into these wicked problems and learning from them and learning from others, because I must admit, I've certainly experienced people going into a project where they were just completely opposed. Nothing that I could do would ever be right. But as they became invested in the process and we took the time to work together and learn together, they actually became the biggest champions as we got to the other side. So I think the
best way to deal with an opponent is to make them a collaborator.
Yeah, no kidding. I think that's great.
Don't pretend that's easy to do.
No.
It's hard to ignore them. It's hard to shout them down. But if you find a way to tap into that different parts of their brain and take them seriously and bring them in as a problem solver, you'll often kind of find that they become a huge advocate.
Well, Martine, thank you so very much for your presentation. It was truly terrific. And from all of the comments that I'm getting online, a lot of other people feel the same way. So I want to sincerely thank you for sharing all of your knowledge with us today and helping all of us to become a little bit better at the work that we do and taking these things into consideration as we develop our processes, as we create our relationships. Very, very important. So big thank you. Any last words you'd like to say to the group before?
I'm just looking at the last audience question and realizing he was asking not about like training for deliberation in early childhood, but early childhood being a topic. And yes, there is. NIF does have an issue guide on early childhood education. I imagine Public Agenda might have as well, but I know NIF does because I helped work on it a little bit.
Okay. Well, we'll certainly try and send out all of the relevant information when we send out the recording and everything else. I have one last question here, and then I think we'll wrap up. This question is about citizen censors. On how does that work?
Say that again.
Apparently, you mentioned citizen censors, and how does that work? Censors, SENSORS.
Yeah, I'm not sure what I said. I mean, I haven't used that term purposely, at least. So. No
worries. Nope, no worries. Just wanted to make sure that I didn't miss any of the questions. So, Martine, thank you again. Apologies to everyone out there for any background noise. We thank you for your patience with that. Just a quick reminder that our January webinar is going to be about digital engagement, and we have really some of the really top gentlemen in the business will be joining us in January to talk a little bit about when to use it, how to use it, why to use it, all of those different types of things. So we sincerely hope that you will join us in January for our digital engagement. And now it's my pleasure to wish everyone a happy holiday season. And again, really, Martine, thank you so very much for sharing this. And with that, we're going to bring this to a close. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye now.